All roads lead to power. And on this show, we're going to break that idea down a little bit. What is power? Who has it? And how do you get it? I'm your host, Jeff Coulard.
Welcome to the show.
Is a realization that power without love is reckless and abusive, and that love without power is sentimental and anemic.
Because the so-called real world of men and money and power hums merrily along on the fuel of fear and anger and frustration and craving and the worship of self. The really important kind of freedom involves attention and awareness and discipline.
If people don't learn power, people don't wake up. And if they don't wake up, they get left out.
Okay, welcome to the first episode of Powerful, the live stream version. And so I've been doing a podcast for about the last year, and I've decided to shift gears and do some live interviews on Facebook and YouTube to bring on interesting guests and have really fascinating conversations about important topics related to things like power and leadership and life more broadly. And so today I'm thrilled to invite someone who I've learned a ton from in the time that I've known her. She's a leadership and business coach and just an all-around wonderful human being. Her name is Kimberley McAdams, and I'm thrilled to spend the rest of the evening here with her talking about artificial harmony, this thing that happens in relationships and on teams where there's conflict and there's tension, but it's not being talked about and it's not certainly not being dealt with. And it impacts our work and it impacts us as people in lots of profound ways. And it's something that we really need to look at and address. And I spend a lot of time looking at and addressing both my own life, but also with the teams that I work with. And so without further ado, I'm going to welcome Kimberley McAdams to the show. A quick note on how this works. Feel free to comment, to like, to share. If you have questions, absolutely just drop that into the comment thread on whatever platform you happen to be watching us on, and we'll be able to see that and we'll be able to respond to it in real time, or else we'll get to it at some point in the show. So don't be shy about asking us questions, agreeing with us, disagreeing with us. That's why this is a live show, so that you can be engaged as well. So again, thank you so much for being here. And Kimberley, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Jeff. It's lovely to be here.
Well, it's great to see you and to talk about something I think that's near and dear to our hearts, which is leadership and helping leaders get the most out of the experience and out of their people and create the conditions for their people to really thrive in. And I know that you and I have both been witness to and chatting a lot about psychological safety in the workplace. And one of these symptoms, I would call it, of psychological safety, which is this idea of artificial harmony. Can you expand a little bit on what are we talking about when we're talking about artificial harmony?
Yeah, it was a concept that initially I thought it was more of a feeling. So my background's in the restaurant industry in years, and I think every one of us listening to the show has walked into a restaurant before. And even though things look clean and the lighting's good and maybe the host at the front has a smile on her face, there's just something that's off, and we can feel it. We can feel it when we walk into a room. We can feel it when we're in a meeting. So an example would be if somebody's been on the phone the whole time, or laughing to themselves, or maybe even, like, heaven forbid, playing a game in the background and nobody's saying anything, and we're looking at each other, and maybe there's eye contact between people, but there's nobody saying anything because we don't want to ruffle feathers or we don't want to disturb the peace. Another thing that came to my radar, so a lot of my work used to be in the US, and I used to get again and again and again from our US clients of, Canadians are just so nice. And in the beginning, I'm like, wow, that was a really great compliment. And as I thought about it further and further, I'm like, wait a second. What is different? Like, why is this such a part of our culture where it's not necessarily as much of a culture in the US? And what I found was, with doing our work, mostly with US companies, they would name what the problem was right away. They're like, here's our problem. We talk over each other, or we need to figure out a decision-making matrix, or we need to have a better way to solve these problems. What are you going to do to help us? Whereas Canadians more so are like, well, I don't really want to throw anybody under the bus. Or, no, we don't have a problem. Everything's good. And so it's this artificial harmony of perceiving, and maybe even a truth, a high level truth, is that things are good. But when we start to peel back the layers a little bit, it's actually not true. So.
Okay. And so you mentioned like the feeling, and we've probably all had that feeling that something's off in a relationship or it's off on a team and nobody's naming it. is it also behaviors? Like, is also a set of actions? Because that's what I tend to find myself looking for on teams. Like, what are the behaviors here that are keeping conflict suppressed? Do you have any that kind of things that you look for? I know I've got a couple that really stand out for me, but I'm curious if you have like, oh, is there a warning sign on a team that you walk in, you're like, oh, that's a red flag, red flag. We've got artificial harmony.
So in a meeting that I was in a couple of weeks ago, one of the people in the meeting kept saying, okay, well, I'm curious about, or if they say something along the lines of, that's interesting. And those are some of the words that can be indicators, but it's more so, it's those words paired with a tone. And so I think we were talking about it earlier today, that of communication that's absorbed, only 7% comes from the words that we speak, 45% comes from our body language, and 48% comes from our tone of voice. And so it's usually the artificial harmony, the big red flags are usually that tone. Even though the words seem okay, like I'm interested or I'm curious, words seem great, but compared with a tone or a body language, if there's maybe a dialogue just in between two people where multiple people in the room are being ignored, that's another indicator too. The other thing too is that, like, if things in the meeting aren't going along smooth, or if we're not talking about the real issue, or like things like that, we feel it. Like it's palatable. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Maybe let's ask the listeners what they've noticed for artificial harmony. When you think of unresolved conflict, unresolved tensions on your teams or in your life, what are some of those signs and symptoms? And we'll see if we can throw them up on the screen here. So feel free to type them into the chat. What are some things that you've experienced on teams that you would call artificial harmony or kind of conflict avoidance? I think one that I see a lot of is meetings before meetings or meetings after meetings, right? Where the real issue isn't talked about in the meeting itself. And there's a lot of energy and effort that goes into prepping people for the meeting, right? So the leader's walking around, having lots of one-on-one meetings with colleagues, trying to get people on board or on side with a certain decision or direction that they want to take the meeting in, kind of building alliances. And it's just a ton of extra time and energy to get a little coalition together so that the meeting goes how they want it to go, or after the meeting, when we've had a meeting that maybe didn't go as well as we wanted it to, or a decision wasn't made, or people didn't like a decision, and then all of a sudden people scatter out of the boardroom and a bunch of doors close and all of these conversations are happening, right? And so I guess maybe there's a question buried in there around like what's normal, healthy, productive venting, because that's like I would call it venting or gossiping or like backroom conversations that aren't coming out into the open. There's a certain level of that I think is just normal, right? Where you're going to buy a beer for a colleague and you're going to go out and you're going to vent a little bit about, the bad decision that the boss made. But maybe when it becomes chronic, or maybe like, what's the distinguishing factor for you around some of the behaviors with artificial harmony?
There's the way that I like to think about it. So if it's a conversation that's happened once, so if I have a favorite colleague that I work with and I'm like on the phone to her or him right after being like, can you believe what they just said in that meeting? And it's energy, right? That venting is energy and it needs to go somewhere. Like we need to actually get it out of us. If that is a habit and keeps us from actually making traction and moving forward on the development of the team, or pulls my attention away from actually transforming or being a catalyst for what's important or what needs to happen. So if I'm complaining or if I'm venting once, that's different than venting again and then again. There's a difference between what I call a complaint, a pain, and a stressor. So a complaint is something that like it's surface level. It's like, can you believe what they did in that meeting? That's silly. Complaints can easily become pains. A complaint becomes a pain when it happens repeatedly of like, I really don't like that person as a leader. That's a pain. And when it shifts from complaint to pain is really when we need to do something about it. Because if we don't do something about it, it becomes a stressor. So stressor is usually something that keeps us up at night, right? And that could be, gosh, I really don't like my leader and I need to look for another job. And what's that going to look like? Because I need to feed my family. And that's how easily those things can change. I have relationships with a few different people in my life, and we call it, when we need to vent, I call and I say, can I buy 5 minutes? That's like the universal language of I need something that, and that is, and they know on the other end to say like, okay, what do you want from me here? Do you just need to vent, or do you want some coaching on this topic? Because sometimes if I get coaching, or if any of us get coaching and all we need to vent is, that's just, there's going to be a misalignment there because we might be a little bit frustrated.
For sure.
But it's a by 5 minutes, and I just vent everything that we need to, and they say, okay, what else? And then I'll go maybe for a little bit more, and they'll say, what else? And I'll maybe go for a little bit more, and then finally all of that energy is out, and they're like, hey, great, what are you going to do about it now? It's to the point, the purpose of venting for me, I think, is it's because I need to figure out, or any of us need, and this is what I coach my clients too, is we actually need to figure out what action we want to take as a result. We just can't keep spinning in that drama cycle. Otherwise, we start to go down the spiral a little bit.
And I like how you've teased that out into distinct phases of, that kind of annoyance, that thing you might complain about, to actually, this is kind of painful. This is getting in the way. This is stopping us from taking action, to the stressor of like, actually, I can't take this anymore, or something's going to break, or something's going to break. And it might be a relationship, or it might be my job, right? Or it might be who knows what. We've got a comment here from Vince that meetings before and after the meetings are a definite sign of false harmony. He probably sees it in some of the organizations that he works with. Tracy says, that agreement at the table, but then lobbying for a different outcome after the meeting to specific parties. I think that's probably something that's a definite sign for me of artificial harmony. That false agreement, right? It's one thing to not say anything, but it's one thing to actually put your hand up and say, yeah, it's a good idea, and then go around and try and sabotage that or sandbag that.
Well, let's dig in. I think that's such an important point, and let's actually dig into that a little bit, because I'm curious as to why people, and I've got some theories, I'm curious what you think, Jeff, around why people agree right in that moment, but then lobby for different things after the fact. Like, what do you think are some of the reasons there?
I think it's safety. I think all roads lead to safety and power eventually. It's called Powerful for a reason, this show. All roads lead to power. I think leadership is just taking our power and operationalizing it to affect change. And sometimes it's in the operationalizing of our power that we accidentally, unintentionally, often make things unsafe for people. And so that would be a sign for me that agreeing, I don't know if I'm sure you're familiar with the trauma response kind of spectrum: fight, flee, freeze. I see subtler versions of that. I call them the raw responses, and it's resistance, acquiescence, and withdrawal. And saying yes at the table, but then going around and doing something is a combo of acquiescence and resisting, right? So I'm going to acquiesce in this moment, but then I'm going to shift gears and resist this decision or resist this thing. So it's the same idea, just the behaviors are more subtle than actually fighting or running away that we might see in a big unsafe circumstance. But to me, that's a sign of safety.
Well, and I think it's so, yes. And there's like, what's our part in it as an individual, right? If I know that I'm saying like, yep, I just want to get out of this meeting, and so I'm going to say whatever I need to say so I can do whatever I want to do on the back end, there's a part that I hold in that. There's a responsibility that I hold. There's also a part within the team and the organization to create a safe space for those pieces to be heard too. And so it is a both and. They're overlapping circles. What I see a lot in organizations that is like, well, I don't feel safe, and so I'm not going to say anything. And it's like, okay, let's actually dig into that a little bit, because safety, psychological safety especially, is an outcome of something, right? It's an outcome of speaking our truth. It's an outcome of other people being able to create space to hear our truths. It's the ability to take action on them. It's the ability to know right at the end of the meeting, even if everybody wants to go because they've got back-to-back meetings, being like, you know what, I actually don't think that we landed on something here, and have other people say, okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I love that point. And I think it's good that we hit it early in the conversation around safety being an outcome of something, because then we can investigate an outcome of what. And like, what are the conditions that create safety? What are the behaviors and the actions and the rhythms and the structures that create safety for people? I think too often safety is assumed. Safety is one of those things that we think that trust and safety is a starting point. with teams, and it's simply not, right? Like it is an outcome of actions and inactions, right, that people take. And so thinking about it that way, thinking that it's something that we build or break, and I firmly believe that is leadership's job, right? And so yes, there's a responsibility for people, but if you don't have power in the room, like it's power's job to keep things safe. And so we can talk about that another time. We can dig into power, you and I. We've got a couple more comments here, and then I've got a couple of questions about psychological safety and artificial harmony before we get into like why is it so important, right? Because I think that there's some things that we need to talk about about safety, harmony, and conflict, and an aversion to conflict that I think is holding teams back. So we'll talk about that in a second, but let's see what Julie had to say, which is a sign or a symptom of artificial harmony is having to reread your emails a bunch of times to make sure you aren't going to offend anyone who it's going to. So being like extra, maybe there's some paranoia in there. Maybe there's a little bit of like, I really want to be super careful because there's some reactivity maybe on the team.
And that's so tough too. That's so tough because as we were talking about with the 745-48 that I said, so 7% of what we say, how communication is absorbed. So it's 2 studies that came out of MIT, and both came back the exact same, except tone and body language were flipped. So one came back with 7% of communication is absorbed through our words, 45% is body language, and 48% is tone. And in the other study, they were flipped. Point is, especially with emails, that is why emails are so dangerous. And think about how much time we spend personally trying to craft emails with really trying to control what the other person is going to see or feel or sense as a result of hearing it. And think about what a time waster that is in so many different ways, right? What if we could just, because we can have the intention of doing no harm, right? We can have the intention of coming across. It really depends on that other person and what kind of day that they've had, what past interactions you've had, what other truths they're holding of what kind of tone they're going to read into that email. And that's like, emails are so dangerous. A piece of coaching that I always give clients is if there is a conversation to have around feedback or curiosity, we rely so much on emails, and my offer always is like pick up the phone because at least people can actually hear our voice. Mm-hmm. And we can dive a little bit deeper rather than a one-way exchange. And that's not always possible.
Yeah, and I think it's important. And I think in this increasingly virtual world where people are working remotely, there's a temptation to just fire it off in an email, and we're all busy and all overwhelmed. And so I think that the pace of communication, we treat everything as if it's super important, right? And so people are scanning through these emails, and they're reading some feedback, some pin sheet conflict type thing right behind something else that's trivial, right? And so we don't necessarily put the priority on it that we need to make it stand out, and to make it, I think, mutually, transmitting what we want to transmit, and people being able to receive it in that way. It's like, you're right, texts and emails, super tricky to do that. And I've been on the receiving end, and I've definitely been on the giving end of some of those written correspondence that don't land how we think they're going to land.
Well, think about a classic example is like text message conversations with a romantic partner, right? Or spouse or whatever. It's like those can go astray real quickly.
Why would you put a period on that? Why is there a period on that?
Why is it all caps?
My phone got stuck and I couldn't figure out how to. Right. Oh, good point. Let's talk a little bit about, actually, we've got a comment here from Dale, so I want to pop it up here because he took the time to write it, so we should take the time to read it and talk about it. Dale says that I find that most people have almost a PTSD reaction to conflict, and that we're afraid of speaking up. And I think that maybe that we're trending into the territory of like, why does this matter so much? Like, why would we bother speaking up? Why should we embrace conflict, and what type of conflict should we embrace? Because I think that we all probably do have a bit of an aversion to conflict. I think there's a innate desire for us to be safe, especially inside of a community. We're a very tribal being, and so being the shit disturber in a community, like, I think we probably have an aversion to that. And maybe some people have an almost PTSD-like reaction to conflict, depending on conflict and how present it's been in their life. What are your thoughts on that? And maybe we can trend into, okay, we've kind of identified what it is and some set of feelings and behaviors around it. Why should we care? Like, why is artificial harmony a problem?
Well, I think one of the first things to name is we actually all have a very different definition of what conflict is. Conflict is, so don't have the dictionary definition in front of me. It's a disagreement or a disalignment with what is happening in the moment. And so it's like, no, actually, I think this, or, say more about that because I don't know if I agree, right? It could be many, many, many different layers. It could feel soft. It could feel hard. It depends on how it's brought up. It depends in the context. It depends all of these different pieces. And I think, Dale, you're right in terms of we all have our own truths and our own experience of what happens when we enter into conflict, whatever that meaning is that we place on that word, conflict. What was your question again, Jeff? I went
There's
off.
a question in there. Why is it important? Why is artificial harmony? Like, why should a leader care? Or if you've noticed artificial harmony in relationships that you have in your life, what's the benefit of addressing them? Like, why would we try and get into conflict? Right? What's the upside?
So here's like a big example I think that we can all identify with exactly, especially in this moment. So conflict breeds innovation. Conflict breeds disruption. Conflict breeds something else that's different. So COVID, big disruptor right now, right? Huge disruptor in terms of how we're doing business, what kind of relationships we're having, how much time we spend on Zoom, all of these different pieces that are happening. And it has caused us to create new ways of being. And that is the purpose of conflict, is this functional tension between how things used to be and how things could be, and that messy middle that's in the middle. Some of the best, so going back to that comment around Canadians are so nice. Canadians are nice because we say yes to things, because we go along with what is offered or what is said. The challenge with that sometimes is that there's no, what's the word that I'm looking for? There's no pause in there. There's no critical reflection. There's no really, is this the right way? Or is this actually the way that we've always done things? And what happens, especially in business, is if we're not constantly innovating and getting better, we're actually getting worse because we're not on that upward climb, even just to maintain, because there's other businesses around us that are getting better and better and better. And so if we're not embracing the conflict, if we're not cultivating all of our courage and our heart and challenging ideas and concepts and ways of being in productive ways, then I would argue that we're actually not. So the definition of insanity is doing the same thing and expecting a different result. That's the exact same thing. If we're not embracing conflict, is we're doing the same thing, we're expecting a different result, but we're actually not embracing the kind of messy middle in it all. Mm-hmm. Here's a really great example. So we've all been to a restaurant before. And this is a lot of my examples are from the restaurant industry because I think it's something that we can all identify with. And restaurants are like little kind of petri dishes because there's so much happening in there. We've all had the server that I call the robo server. They come up to your table and they say, "Hi, how are you doing today? What would you like to drink?" And they come back a little bit later and they're like, "Hi, would you like an appetizer? Or what can I get you for an appetizer? Have you thought about..." And in terms of how memorable is that experience? Well, not at all, right? But if they create something that's different, that's out of the norm, that even embraces if somebody says, "Oh, well, I've got some allergies," well, that could actually be a definition of conflict because it's a different way. I mean, in restaurants, we can expect that people are going to have some allergies, but it creates new options and creates new avenues that we can go down, right? Or, yeah, stuff like that.
So it sounds to me like we've identified conflict as like this kind of conflict, and people who are listening to the audio version aren't going to see me bumping my fists together. But we've very much, I think, characterized conflict as a win-lose, right? There's just only so much of a pie, and we're fighting over that pie, right? And if I lose, that means you win, and so conflict therefore is bad because there's a risk, right? We're at risk, and we talked earlier today, actually, you and I, about a spectrum. that we all kind of live our days on. We live our lives on this spectrum where we spend some of it in what I call an at-risk mentality, where we're thinking like, what do I have to lose? Right. And that kind of thinking has us avoiding conflict often, right? Because we don't want to engage in something we might lose, right? Versus being at stake, which is what do I have to gain, right? Which is where innovation lives, which is where risk taking lives. And getting into conflict is a risk, right? Because there's an uncertain outcome. So I think that, if we're going to talk about the upside of addressing artificial harmony, because I do believe that that's a symptom of a lack of safety on a team, we actually have to embrace conflict. And I think that maybe is the distinction that a lot of leaders who are trying to build psychological safety, they're having trouble wrapping their heads around, like, how do we have conflict in the boardroom and keep it safe? And so they err on the side of keeping it safe, which often means kind of squashing conflict, being kind, being nice, being supportive, like all good characteristics that we want in leadership, but not pushing people, not necessarily talking about or like challenging issues, right? Putting the most important things on the table, encouraging debate, those other types of behaviors that are going to drive innovation. So I see that tension often. How would you characterize kind of an aversion to conflict? Or you can talk about whatever you want. I don't know if there's a question in there. I just rambled.
Well, what I really like about what you shared in that, I don't think it was a ramble, but in that piece that you shared was the difference between at stake and at risk. And there's something about, so what the difference between the two is for me is a stake is something that we can really like put in the ground and something that's really, really important to us to get behind. So if, getting along at all costs is our stake, well, there's probably going to be artificial harmony that shows up. There's probably going to be meetings after the meetings and meetings before the meetings. But if we make a stake that is around, we just want to be the best possible team that we could be, or we want to, innovate the way that our business unit does business, or we want to, it's really about getting alignment with that. And then that creates, I think, a little bit more safety around those disagreements, because we're disagreeing in service of something, right? We've got this high dream or this vision, and we can have all kinds of different disruptions, because while we may be misaligned on some things, we are absolutely aligned on something else that's very important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see that, like, very, very clear alignment for vision and values, right? Like what it is we're here to do and how we're going to go about doing it, the qualities that we want, like we're going to do it in these ways, but tons and tons and tons of disagreement and different ideas and opinions about how we're going to get there, right? Because that's how we get our best ideas. And I think that for a lot of the teams that I work with, it's shifting conflict from, it's not about individuals. It's not about you, right? I know you're really attached to your idea, but if you can let go of the ego and the person, like your personal investment in the idea, and if we can just talk about the idea, if we can put that on the table, and we can all agree that it's in service of getting to that place that you describe, maybe that's a better team, maybe it's a more innovative product, maybe it's whatever, right? Then that idea can, like the intern, the guy that just started 2 weeks ago, his idea is just as valuable as the CEO's, right? I think that's an idealistic type of world where good ideas should come from anywhere, right? Inside of an organization. And they often don't, right? How often is it that, and I was guilty of this as a leader, I'd wake up and I'd have a shower, and in the shower, I'd have an idea, and I'd drive to the office and I'd try and implement that idea in like an hour, right? And my team's like, seriously, Jeff, like slow the F down, right? Like, yes, that's a problem, but there's lots of different ways to deal with it. So I think that shows up. Again, that's a safety piece, right? Oftentimes teams don't feel safe in challenging ideas and putting the vulnerability, I guess, that's associated with it. It's an interesting discussion that is starting to veer us off course a little bit from artificial harmony, but that's how this works. That's podcasts with Jeff, is we go wherever the conversation goes. So maybe let's hit pause. You can keep talking, but I'm going to, in a second, I'm going to ask the guests, the people that are watching live, if you have a question, if you want to redirect this conversation in some way, or if you've got a need that isn't being met in this conversation, you've got a question for us, by all means, throw it into the chat and we'll do a little bit of a Q&A as we roll. But are any other thoughts that you have on kind of why it matters before we move into like what can we do about it? Like practically speaking, what can leaders do to tackle this issue on their teams or in their relationships?
Yeah, I've got maybe a bridge comment. So I want to introduce this concept that is the difference between alignment and agreement. And they're actually two different concepts, right? We can be aligned on something and not agree. And I think that where artificial harmony shows up a lot is we think that agreement is alignment. So alignment is, so taking kind of a big example of, Jeff, you like skiing and I like snowshoeing. And I was like, no, I am a skier, by the way. But I would say like, no, downhill skiing is for crazy people. I can't believe you go down the hill that fast with things strapped on your feet. I'd way rather, trudge through the snow on my snowshoes. We're out of alignment, or pardon me, we're out of agreement. What we're aligned on is, what I can really get behind is that we both really enjoy snow sports. We love being outside. We love being active. We love the hot chocolate or the scotch or whatever that comes up that comes after being those sports. But so on a team, it might look like, for a product design, for instance, it's like that packaging really doesn't articulate our brand. It doesn't say the messaging that we want. But the agreement or the alignment might be, but you know what? I know that a really sleek packaging that communicates our brand really well is important to both of us, even though we're out of agreement of what that might look like. And so for teams kind of going in this direction, I would say seek alignment and celebrate disagreement and know that the two are different.
And alignment fundamentally on vision and values, right?
Yeah.
And the strategies that we're going to take, or the concrete, how this looks in practice, lots of disagreement, right? Lots of good ideas, lots of, competition of ideas on the team.
Yeah, so some teams call it a mission of their team, right? So you've got your big company purpose, or your big company mission, you've got your values. I would say for most teams, there is a purpose, or self-organizing teams even, there is a purpose of why the meeting is there, or what the mission of what needs to happen. Another way to say that I like is like, what is our stake? What is something that we're prepared to, in your language, Jeff, prepared to put in the ground that we want to rally around? So a stake for a program that I was a part of recently is everyone is a leader. Everyone is a leader. And so any disagreement that came up, anything else, it was like, nope, we stand behind that everybody is a leader. And so we need to have the disagreement, have the however else that looks like, but we come back around, we're totally aligned that everyone is a leader.
Awesome. No, I love that. I think whatever you call it, purpose, why, vision, mission, stake, you just got to have something, right? You got to have something. And I've found that anytime a team can create that, anytime a team can build that, you get much higher levels of buy-in. Right? It's not being imposed by some other place. Oh, hey, we're doing this now. It's something that's been co-created. So there's a process of co-creation, I think, that's really important for that, to get full buy-in and to get ownership. Because that's ultimately, when I talk to a lot of leaders, and when I think about times that I've led teams, I'm like, I really just want ownership. I want people to take ownership of the outcomes and the impact that this team has. And so, and to do that, we need to have something to take ownership of, right? And that's usually outcomes or impact. I don't see any questions that have popped up, so we are either answering them all as we go, which is probably not true, or people are having a time thinking of a question, and that's okay. And so, but if something comes up, feel free to drop it into the comment stream. I am going to take a quick commercial break. It's not actually a commercial break. It's just hey, before you leave us tonight, you should go and check out KimberleyMcAdams.com. She's a brilliant coach and trainer of leaders, and I admire her greatly. So you should, at the very least, go and look her up and check her out. So I don't get to plug myself on this show, or I guess I suppose I could, but it feels kind of narcissistic. And so I love plugging my guests. So I'll throw this up again at the end of the night. All right. What can we do about it? What can we practically do? So if we're a leader or we're on a team and we see these symptoms and signs of artificial harmony. We feel it. There's a tension there that isn't being resolved. Conflict, there's an aversion to conflict on the team. What can we do about it? What are some practical, let's maybe dig in a little bit to if you've got some tips or strategies or activities that people can actually do to surface these tensions and then deal with them. I think that might be a really helpful way for us to tie this conversation up.
Yep. Well, the first thing that I just thought about, even Jeff, when you were saying that, is just naming it. Just naming like, hey, I think we've got some artificial harmony going on here, or I get the sense that we're not actually getting to the root of the issue. What is this about? So anything that you're thinking for a leader or anybody else that's on this conversation, if you're thinking like, we're not quite hitting the mark here in your head, my offer would be to actually just verbalize that. Whatever voice is here, articulate it, because I guarantee if you're thinking it, somebody else in the room is thinking about it. The best way that, because sometimes I think, like, am I the only one that's here? I don't want to disrupt what's happening in here because it's just me. Well, I guarantee that it's not just you. Often, this is one of the best analogies that I heard, is when we're feeling something in a room, and other people may be sensing different things. But it's kind of like we're all touching an elephant in the dark. So what I mean by that is, someone's touching the tail and it's like, this thing's kind of long and stringy and it's got some maybe hair at the end. Somebody else is touching the foot and it's like, no, I'm clearly touching the foot. Somebody else is touching, the back of the elephant. So we're all touching the same thing. Our experience of it is just very different. And so that's the important part with if someone has the courage to like, I don't think we're hitting the mark here, and to say, you know what, I don't think that we're hitting the mark. That gives the space and the opportunity for others to chime in around what their experience is.
No, that's a great piece of advice. I think just naming that there's something that's amiss, right, and not having to have the answer. I think leaders in particular sometimes shy away from naming things that they don't then have answers to. I've had lots of those conversations over the years. Like, you don't actually have to have the answer, right? That's the point of having a team, is that the team gets to develop the answers. The team gets to help us get there. It's actually your job to point out those tensions. It's your job to pull those out. Let's back up a little bit, because there's a question from Dale. And so thank you, Dale, for throwing a question into the chat. And it relates a little bit backwards in the conversation to vision, mission, values. Is it possible to have a shared vision, but different views on how to achieve that vision? I would say yes. And I would say that we absolutely want different views on the strategies to get to our vision. Otherwise, there's, I think, no point in having a team. Like, what's the point of a team? And it's to bring different ideas, to bring new solutions, innovative ideas to the table. I think if those views are like dramatically different, like that might be a problem. But usually my experience has been that they're not. Like, if there's good, clear alignment on what that vision is, that lots of different strategies coming to the table is actually a benefit. It's a net benefit to the team. Kimberly, your thoughts?
Yeah, that's a great example of alignment versus agreement, I think, is there is alignment with a shared vision, right? There's disagreement with how that vision needs to be executed. And there's also can be alignment and disagreement in the how of it. So an example of that, and what I see so often with teams, is we get so in love with our own idea of how we think something should happen, that we, instead of listening to other people, like, who does this in arguments just in general, right? It's like, I know that I'm right. This is the way to do
come
it.
Around, I'll listen long enough so you feel heard, and then I'll just reiterate my point.
Exactly. And I think that we're actually touching on something that's really important with this, is because it's not about setting up camp and advocating for how great our idea is because that is not going to create alignment. It's just not. And so what I always challenge, and we do some exercises sometimes around this, is being able to walk over to somebody else's camp and to say, okay, I want to try on your view a little bit. Help me understand what's happening here. Help me understand your how. Like, why do you think this is important? What is your experience of it? And being able to say, okay, I hear you. These are the things that I hear are important to you. and then go over to the other person's camp and then try those on. And then the third part would be to be open to a third way. That is what we so often, it's like this black or white, this way or this way. And rarely are the best solutions one or the other. The best solutions are always the third way. And so that would, for you, Dale, is, if there's multiple ways on how that needs to happen, there just needs to be some time set aside around really truly understanding what is important to each person, and then what is the best solution that we haven't even thought about yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Awesome. Great advice. We've got another question here. So do you want to keep rolling with questions, or?
I love it. Let's roll a
Right.
question.
And it does tend into what can we do about it. So we're back into the territory of where we thought we might be in this conversation. And it's from Alexander. And he's curious about how we can celebrate conflict and what that looks like to do so. Thoughts on celebrating conflict? I know I've got a few ideas. Celebration in general, I think, is really important. Celebrating the wins as well as the challenges. But I'll let you go first, because I probably took the last one, and I have a tendency to talk too much.
I think we both do. So the best example that I've seen of that, we used to have this. So this is actually perfect because it's one of the hows too, is I used to teach this, it's called safe space. It's kind of 8 elements of communication. And one of those elements of safe space was called naming the moose. And it is silly as that sounds. So picture me working in a US company. I walked down there and they said, we're going to name the moose. I'm like, what's the moose? They're like, oh, it's the Canadian version of the elephant. And I'm like, no, it's not.
Never heard of that.
Let's put that off the table. But what we taught companies was anything that was uncomfortable to say. So for instance, if there's a rumor going around that kind of everybody has heard a piece or two about it and not knowing, or if there's conflict that's kind of brewing under the surface, and someone uses this tool and says, I have a moose. I need to name a moose. And what that does is it puts some like humor on something that is actually very uncomfortable. Try saying I have a moose without actually smiling a little bit, because you think of a moose and then it's like, okay, is it meese? Is there mooses? Is it a big moose? Is it a little moose? There's all kinds of context that it's around that. And when someone says, I have a moose, that is something to celebrate, because it takes courage. It takes a willingness to say something and usually what happens when someone names a moose, my experience anyways, is like the air goes out of the room and it's like, oh, they just said that. and the best reaction in that from leaders or from anybody is like, yeah. And that feels like the exact opposite reaction that should happen in that moment, right? But it's just that we need to pay attention. Is it a chocolate mousse? Could be. I think it's MOUSSE. That would be.
And you eat it with a spoon.
Yeah. But that is one way that we can start to celebrate conflict, is if somebody, so pay attention for those, like we are feeling creatures, right? And when we start to get too close to conflict, that like sometimes we get a pinch or our hair stands up a little bit. For when we start to get close to those conversations, to like, ooh, I think we're getting close, or to bring a little bit of humor into it, and just to celebrate in that moment, because it lets go of the charge and it lets people know that it's safe to do so.
That's a great tip. It's not an elephant in the room; it's a moose. A moose is on the loose. Yeah, I think when it comes to celebration, and so maybe just a quick side tangent before, we can dig in a little bit to some other practices or things that we can think about to deal with artificial harmony. I used to work in addictions treatment, and so worked as a youth worker, supervisor, or shift supervisor manager. So I had like a pretty good tour over about a dozen years in that system, and got to the point where, if you've ever been in a case consultation or like a very focused meeting on how an individual is doing in treatment, it's a very interesting dynamic, because you've got a whole bunch of different perspectives. You've got a psychologist, you've got some teachers, you've got some youth workers, you've got a supervisor, you've usually got an addictions therapist of some kind. And so you've got at least 5 or 6 different professional perspectives on what the problem is and what we should do about it. And so that is just like, that room is saturated with conflict because everybody's got a different perspective on it. And the conflict, the the conflict usually is that the person with the most power in the room drives the conversation, right? Not dissimilar to a leader who walks into a room and everybody shuts up and waits to listen for what the leader's going to say about what this problem is and what we're going to do about it. This would show up over and over again. And we got to the point where we would actually just task somebody. They would sit in, we'd bring in an extra body, and their job was just to mine for conflict. Like they were just like an agitator, and we would celebrate them. And I would give them like an extra day off every once in a while. I would slide them like bonus like treats, because it's not comfortable to be that person who's like, hey, I think actually we need to stop. You need to stop talking, and you need, like, I need to hear from so and actually like actively facilitate that process and have somebody on the team who acts as facilitator. I think you and I have been part of some meetings with some clients before where that facilitation gap is missing, and artificial harmony just loves a poorly facilitated environment, right? Somebody who's not willing to point it out and say, actually, we need to talk more about that, or actually, that's not on the agenda today, right? And maybe manipulate or facipulate is what I call it. It's a little mix of facilitation and manipulation, but to keep the conversation where it needs to be going, which is to addressing the conflict at hand or addressing what's going on. So actually building it into the structure. So I think there's a cultural aspect of psychological safety, and there's a structural aspect. And oftentimes we lean on the cultural aspect, and we think that people will just do it because they're going to know to do it. And it's on the wall as a value statement, right? But building it actually into the structures of our meetings and the structures of our organization, we had some success when we experimented with that. So
I love that. I love having a person that is their job, truthfully. So that is like very tangible, actionable piece. Is like, great, who's going to spot the conflict today? Or like, who's going to mine for the conflict? And just being able to say that. I've also heard of companies that actually start meetings with who's going to moose. And the purpose isn't to get sucked in, because sometimes moose can be drama filled and that could derail the meeting. But the purpose is just to name it, because otherwise it's taking up bandwidth for us in the background. Mm-hmm. There's another, so we talked about clearing assumptions too, a little bit. So assumption clearing is a tool that we have. And the idea with assumption clearing is knowing that each one of us has assumptions that we're walking around with at any given point. Jeff, I have assumptions of you, you have assumptions of me, we haven't really talked about them. And the whole point of clearing assumptions is actually not to get the assumptions on the table. It's to energetically release the person that's holding the assumptions, because often we don't realize that we're holding assumptions until we say an assumption that I'm holding is. And then our brain has to search for whatever those assumptions are. So I've done that, I'd say, I've taught this a number of times, and it usually takes, a lot of practice to be able to be succinct and get to the point of what we want. And I didn't realize how hard it was to name the assumptions that I'm actually holding, or that we're actually holding, or because we're not even aware of them.
That's a great exercise. Can you walk us through it in a bit more detail? Because I assume there's a little bit more to it, or there's a structure at least of doing that so that it is more succinct. Is there, can you describe this tool, or can you walk us through it?
Absolutely. So I'd love to walk you through it. I'll walk you through it. And then do you want to do an example with me? Would you be willing to be a bit of a guinea pig with clearing an assumption?
Of course I would.
Okay, now it gets real.
No, our viewers are gonna spike because everybody's telling their friends, you got to get over here. You got to watch Jeff and Kimberley are about to clear assumptions.
Well, so it's real. So just a bit of background too. Jeff and I, our paths are crossing in a few different ways in a few different projects, and so there's lots of assumptions. So this is perfect timing, and it's real, right? So the framework is it's like 3 parts of a sentence. The first part is an assumption that I'm holding is. The second part of that is, and the impact that has on our relationship is. And then the third part is, what's here for me now? So with the first part of an assumption that I'm holding is my indicator to think about Jeff and what assumptions that I have around him or our work together. with the second part of the impact that that has on our relationship, any assumption that we hold has an impact on our relationship, whether we're conscious of it or not. The saying of the impact that that has on our relationship is just helping us be conscious of all the ways that that is influencing our relationship. My way of being, your way of being, our way of being together. And then the last part of what's here for me now is for actually me to just get present in my body and to feel how it feels that's different now that I've been able to clear that assumption. My experience usually is that after I clear an assumption, and this is what I've heard from clients and people that we've done this exercise with too, is that there's a settling almost. There's like the gap or the kind of energetic, I don't know, like cloud maybe that's in between two people has gone away. And so the purpose of clearing assumptions is to build greater connection, build greater relationship, and being able to just be like radically honest with somebody else. So you ready?
I'm ready. Let's do it.
Let's see. I need to make sure that I've got a good one here. Okay. So Jeff, an assumption that I have about you is that when you asked me to be a part of the show, is that you see me as someone that has a lot of tools and knowledge in this area, and that you want me to do a good job on the show. The impact that that has on our relationship is that I really do want to do a good job, that I prepared, and that maybe I'm a little bit nervous too, of like kind of getting all of the pieces together, making sure that we're executing effectively. That also kind of puts the dynamic on the relationship of, yeah, a little that like an execution and a perfectionist, and there's a bit of sensitivity there too because we want to do a good job. Whew. What's here for me now is settling, and I also cannot believe that I said that on a live stream. So there's that too. But the whole part, like I wanted to do something that's real, right? And so what's the point of doing the exercise if it's just like a not real?
And an assumption that I have of you is that you're going to bring your whole self and you're going to bring your real self. And I've seen you do that in lots of different ways. And so I guess that assumption I had was that you would do that here tonight on the show. And the impact that has on our relationship is, I believe, higher levels of trust around and connection to each other's professional competencies. And what's here for me now is actually a little bit of relief, because there's always a piece of me that worries. And so maybe it's another assumption that sometimes people say yes to me because I can be persuasive and they don't want to let me down. And my assumption was that you would say yes because that's something that was really fulfilling for you and that you would really want to engage with. And so that, I guess, was confirmed with your assumption that it is something that is meaningful. And so that what's here for me now is probably a bit of joy and a bit of, yeah, that's what's here.
So what I will say, what I'd love to challenge everybody that's listening, truthfully, is to become aware of an assumption and clear an assumption with somebody that's important to you. Or if it's a team member, if it's somebody in your family, maybe, bonus points if the relationship isn't as strong as it could be, and see what that has an impact. And maybe they'll feel called to clear an assumption with you. Maybe not. That's not the point. The point is wanting to get clear on what is our stuff in this relationship, what is our part in this, and to get to harmony, like just see and feel, I can sense it, of what shifted with Jeff and I, even when we just did that, right? And so that is, conversations just get real and deeper faster when we're not holding on to any assumptions, or we could be truthful with what assumptions we are holding.
I love that exercise. And that lines up with lots of other things that I like to help people with in clearing out the blocks to meaningful connection, right? Because that tension is there, that assumption is there. Even if it's like a positive assumption about somebody, it's still an assumption that's impacting our relationship, right? And so being able to name it, like you said earlier in the conversation, just the act of naming some of these tensions is often enough to get them moving, right?
Mm.
And I love that framework. I love the simplicity of it and the acknowledgement that there doesn't have to be an and, right? It's just what is, what's so here. This is us just acknowledging what's real for us. And I think that if leaders did more of that, if teams sat in that space a little bit more, in that little bit of uncomfortableness about being true about what they're carrying around with them, I think we'd see less artificial harmony and more productive conflict or healthy conflict on teams for sure. Yeah, thank you for that exercise. I got a lot out of it, and it's my podcast, so that's all that matters, right? I'm sure the viewers got lots out of it too, and I'm sure that people listening in later will also get more out of it. So we are coming up on the hour, which is what I had booked your time for. We do have one question here from Julie that maybe I'll throw up on the screen, and we can kind of round out our conversation with that. And then we've actually got a special guest that's going to join us here in a couple of minutes because he's next week's guest on the show, and we both know him, so I thought we'd throw him on and maybe get some of his reflections on the topic of tonight as a way to close things out, if that's okay with you.
I'd love that. Yeah, I'd love it.
All right. So Julie asks if teams ever resort to artificial harmony because they have too much on their plates. And dealing with conflict is just one more fucking thing to do, right? Is it easier to just ignore it? Those are my words. Those are my assumptions.
100%. I think it happens all the time. Where I think that we need to pay attention to, I just laugh because some of the teams that I've worked with say, I don't have time for dealing with the communication part of it because it gets harder before it gets easier, and I don't have that time. And so you can take your tools and I was like, okay, well, that's easy in the short term, hard in the long term. We got to choose our hard, right? So that's hard. If we choose hard in the short term, easy in the long term, it means that we create space for this. It also is making sure that we're choosing love over fear. Meaning if it's just fear of, I just don't have time, or is it actual fear that I'm afraid of speaking up, or I'm afraid of disrupting, and I care for my team so much that I'm wanting and willing to risk a bit of disruption because I know it's going to be the best for all of us. So that's kind of a sideways way to answer, but it's yes, and pay attention.
Yeah, and I would say that busy work and the status quo and just doing things because we've always done them is a sign of a dysfunctional team, actually. And so to look at what the team's actually working on and some of those patterns and rhythms. I know, like, recently been working with a client around, like, do you need to have that meeting? Like, is that just extra work, or could that have been an email? Like, there's lots of that. And Julie, I know you actually work in the NGO sector, and so it's particularly prevalent. I worked there for a long time. There's a lot of very legitimate, like, tons of work to be done. And we layer on top of that sometimes things that aren't as important as actually getting at the conflict or dealing with the artificial harmony. And so I think from my perspective is to prioritize the artificial harmony. Like Kim said, it's going to be harder. Like, there's going to be an element of, it's like an uphill push for a little while, but you do get over the top with a team or a relationship, and then everything gets easier. Everything gets more efficient and effective, and it's worth that push. Yeah, especially if you're a leader, like, that's your job, actually, if you're a leader, like, to push the team through that. So wonderful. We're still waiting on our special surprise guest. And so while we're waiting, if anybody has any other comments on tonight's live stream, questions for Kimberly, questions for me, don't hesitate to throw them into the chat. Just general comments about the show. Do you like the format? Do you like the people? No, don't tell us if you like the people or not. Just the format of a live Facebook show. I've had a lot of fun, so it's been great. I am going to...
I'd be interested if there's people that are typing away, if they would say one thing that they are wanting to do different as a result of our conversation. Like, because that's the whole point, right? It's like our way of being is different. Our lens starts to expand. It's like, okay, great. In service of what? Like, what's one action that we're going to do that's different? So I'd be curious to know that too.
Yeah, and I'll just add right on top of that is something you're taking away, right? So one thing, an action step, and maybe something that stood out for you from tonight's conversation or a reflection that you've had about your own practice as a leader or on a team. I think that would be great. So another reminder to check out KimberlyMcAdams.com, and I'm sure she's on the various social media platforms. And so I can drop some links into the comments once this show wraps up, and you can find her there. If you're looking for an individual business coach, somebody to help you take your business to the next level, she's wonderful at that. If you're looking for leadership development or communications training and coaching for your teams, then you should definitely seek her out as well. She is, well, you got a taste of it tonight. She's fantastic. She will help you get there.
Thanks, Jeff. Same with this. Can I plug you on your show? Does that work too?
I don't know. Sure. Go for it. I'll put you can check me out, jeffcoulard.com.
There we go. Jeff, so I can share too. Jeff and I have had the pleasure of we're ideating on some of these communication tools and different things. And just as Jeff has said that he's learned so much about me, I will give it right back to him there's no one that makes it more simple and to the point. I love your, I'd call it radical clarity, Jeff. You just have a way of cutting to the point. It's one of the things that I've really appreciated about working with you.
I appreciate that. I have a very much life is too short to put up with too much bullshit approach. And so that sometimes comes out as radical. If it's radical clarity, that's great. Sometimes it's just like, actually, let's just cut through this. There's a path right here that we can just take it straight to here. Dale says the format's awesome. I need to name the moose more. And Kimberly McAdams is awesome. You're right, Dale. She is. And I think we probably all have mooses. We have moose in our life.
Herd of moose. A herd of moose.
And I think that exercise, that clearing the assumptions exercise that we did, like that's a great initial, simple, like theoretically simple. Practically, it's a little more challenging. Practically, like you said, it's hard. It takes some practice. It takes some intention and some effort. So with that, but I think it's definitely worth it. Well,
I will say too, it takes some self-management, especially when someone is clearing an assumption that they have about us. What I find anyways, is all I want to say is how they're wrong or how they're right when I'm hearing that. And so it takes a huge amount of self-management to actually not respond because it's not about us. We can circle back at another time and follow up on the conversation, or maybe there's some assumptions about that. But it's really, remember, the assumption clearing is actually for the person that's clearing the assumption to feel different.
Dale likes meese. Meese. I'm gonna have to look it up now. What is it? I think moose is plural and singular. It's one of those weird ones. But actually, here's a really great question from Alexander that maybe Kimberly you can tackle. How would one identify when to engage a business coach, and what should a leader be looking for to gauge this? This is right in your wheelhouse. You do a lot of business coaching. I do different other things. I do a little bit, but I'm going to pass this one to you because this is your wheelhouse.
Yeah, so leadership and business are kind of my two kind of genres, I guess, my two pockets. There's usually some signs or symptoms when someone reaches out to me. Number one is they've tried to grow, but they don't know where to start or what happens, or they've grown and made big mistakes. Like I've had companies that have opened a second location and had to close down because it just didn't work effectively. If there's a lot of turnover within the team, I have, especially small businesses or new leaders that are really trying to grow, experience a ton of turnover. And just really wanting to get to that next level in terms of sales or impact. Like I've had leaders, it's more rare, but leaders just say, I really want to make a bigger impact with my team, or I want a succession plan. I don't want to be an owner operator anymore. I just want to operate my bit, or I just want to kind of work on the marketing or be an absentee owner. That would be another piece too. So growing your leadership team, paying attention to turnover. If you've gotten to a ceiling in terms of your sales and can't bust through to that next level.
Yeah, so it's about leveling up in some realms, and I think that the typical entrepreneur journey is either a fast start and getting some sales, getting some traction, and then we hit this plateau where, and I certainly hit this a couple of years ago, where I had too much work. and I was like, oh shit, like my system's broke. I broke. I was on the path to breaking. And usually, necessity is the mother of invention, or the mother of reaching out for help, right? And so usually it's this, like, I can't do it anymore. I always encourage people to reach out before that point, right? And I was lucky enough to have some good peers and some good mentors in my life that saw the signs. Were like, hey Jeff, you need to like think about how you're structuring this, because you only have X number of hours in the day and you can't be working all of them. So I think that's the piece, that disconnect, like you say, from owner operator to business owner and entrepreneur, like that is a leap. And I think that, I think that people should reach out sooner, probably, like get some sort of support community, and doesn't necessarily have to be a business coach. I think a business coach is a great solution for certain ranges. And usually I tell people, like, revenue wise, it's when you can afford a business coach, right? Like, and you don't want to kill your business, or like your business to suffer thousands of dollars in business coaching fees every month if you can't actually afford it, or you can't feed your kids, or your mortgage is at risk, or like those types of things. There are other ways to get support, and group masterminds, group coaching, or mastermind communities, or just a peer advisory group. Both of us are part of a peer advisory group that is hugely instrumental. And speaking of peer advisory groups and business coaches, who do we have here? It is Mr. Vince Fowler. I'm going to add him to the stream. Thank you, Alexander, for the comment and the questions, and for tuning in tonight. It really means a lot. And I did get your comment about how you appreciate the show and the conversation and the openness and vulnerability of both the presenter and the host, mostly the presenter, not the host. And Gordon Grant says, thanks, Jeff and Kimberly. My brain is full and tired. Thanks for tuning in, Gordon. And I'm going to pop Vince into the stream, and I'm probably going to reorganize us. And I shouldn't be the big one. Vince should be the big one. Welcome, Mr. Vince Fowler. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, Vince.
Hey, my pleasure. Hello, Kimberly.
Well, hello. What a pleasure.
Yeah, look at me figuring out how to use technology on the way up.
I texted Vince earlier today. I was like, hey, can you pop in on my first live stream show right at the end? Because you're coming on next week as our guest. And so I wanted to introduce you and sell the audience on coming back next week, same time, same place, for Vince Fowler. And we'll talk about all kinds of interesting things. So thank you for jumping on. And what do you have to say about artificial harmony, and or whatever you want to talk about? Because it's now 9:37 at night and you're on Jeff's show. So
I think your subject was excellent. I was on there for the first half and then life. But I see artificial harmony happen all the time. And, there's all sorts of books that have been helpful, whether it's Brene Brown and Deirdre Lee or Patrick Lencioni, or just having discussions with you, Jeff, on, what's missing. I've said the other day, there was some challenges with a particular client, and I said, when there's a rub, there's an absence of one of a few things, and absence of needs being met, absence of values being addressed. There's an absence of structure, or a process, or the process that does exist is fractured, or a couple other things I said. But artificial harmony can be very toxic. It can ruin organizations from the inside out. It's a self-inflicted wound. And so people are always worried about the competitor taking them out. Nah. Artificial harmony will take you out at the knees a lot faster than any competitor could ever do. So it was a very, very good discussion.
Awesome. And can you give us a little bit of insight into, because I'm always fascinated by teams that face dangerous circumstances, and your former military, and rugby, and like high competition, and in some cases like very real dangerous situations in unsafe environments. How do you foster psychological safety, or what's the importance of psychological safety in that environment? And what are your thoughts on that in a team environment? I'm always interested in those, because that's a case study, I guess, those kind of teams.
Yeah. Well, just for full disclosure, I didn't play rugby for Canada. It's ironic that we're talking about I did play high level sport, but not for Canada. And I just happened to wear this jersey today. So, when you had said to me a while back, safety is an outcome, or did you say, trust is an outcome? And I really had to think about that, because the word trust gets used a lot. So when I think of when I think of high performing teams and both, sport and military, for me, a deployment overseas with Canadian Airborne Regiment, and what really solidifies the unit is one of the things, and maybe this contributes to trust, is shared suffering. We're all working for a cause. We all attribute very, very similar values in our organization, and there's this component of shared suffering, and that's what I find is the sticky part of teams. Now, a marriage has shared suffering. Just introduce a brand new baby to the house or a brand new dog to the house. There's some shared suffering. Uncertainty like COVID, there's some shared suffering. So it doesn't have to be deployment overseas or sport, but there's a certain element of suffering that we go through together. And I was listening to a speech by Rear Admiral so-and-so. I can't think of, he gave this speech at University of Texas, Pronghorns. But when Navy SEALs are going through BUDS training, and specifically Hell Week, it is driven to just make people quit. And all they do is they play with uncertainty, cold, and fatigue. And that shared suffering, someone will either quit because they're not really connected to themselves or the team, or they'll bond. And you would love to think, well, SEAL training has been around for a long time. This must be predictable. And even the great Angela Duckworth hasn't been able to predict, who's going to be the grittiest one to survive SEAL training. Shared suffering for me has always been something that has created strong bonds. I talked to a friend today. His name's Paul Powers. We were in the military together, the airborne together, Somalia together. And when we pick up the phone, it's like we never missed a day. And there's just an understanding, and the trust is solid, and the intimacy and the compassion and the empathy is there. Anyways, I feel like I'm rambling, but those are all components to really strong teams.
Oh, I love that. And I love that sets the tone for next week's conversation, which is going to be about embracing the suck, which is a favorite hashtag of yours that I see on lots of posts. And I think I've got a t-shirt coming that says embrace the suck across it.
And so isn't it ironic that we order these t-shirts, embrace the suck, and I get a call from my supplier. So all the t-shirts have been ordered, and they went to the screen printer, because this time we're not using heat press, we're using silk screening. And the silk screener got the entire order wrong. Everything wrong. Talk about suck. For me, it's a delay in delivery, but he's got some talking to do. So ironically,
it should be a special edition t-shirt. You can double the price and say this is a one of a kind order. You can't get these.
Yeah, exactly. So, but yeah, life, for anybody who has any experience with suck in life, you'll want to tune in next week, because, what if I told you that life will never, ever be absent of suck, but there is most certainly something we can do about it.
That's a good teaser. That's a good plug for tuning in next week. Kimberly, I saw you lean in and open your mouth just as I started talking. So I'm going to give you the last word, because you are tonight's guest, and I'm going to make you bigger. So I'm just going to swap you out for Vince there.
Well, I just love the tie in between embracing the suck and artificial harmony, because artificial harmony, it sucks. And how to change it also sucks. And so we just got to embrace it to get through it. So I love it.
Yeah, we get to choose our suck, as Vince will probably tell us tomorrow. Thank you, everyone, for coming in. Vince, thank you for sharing a little bit of your evening. I'm going to throw this up on the screen. That's next week, September 21st, same time, same place, live with Vince Fowler. We're going to be talking again about embracing the suck, but also mindset and psychological immunity, a few topics that we've been bantering around and tossing back and forth. So, and if you've listened to the podcast before, you'll recognize Vince Fowler. We had a conversation about a year ago. He was episode 2 or 3, I think, on the podcast. So he's the returning guest. So he's a crowd favorite. So thank you for carving out time, both of you, Kimberly and Vince. Much appreciate both of you. And we'll see y'all soon.
Looking forward to seeing both of you sooner than later.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.
Thanks, pal.